Welcome to the second OSC webinar on the trade reporting rules for OTC derivatives. The initial trade webinar has been updated to reflect these amendments. This presentation will concentrate just on the amendments to the Ontario OTC derivatives trade reporting rule.
On April 17th, the Ontario Securities Commission published amendments to the Ontario Derivatives Trade Reporting Rule. Subject to ministerial approval, the amendments will come into force on July 2, 2014. There are three main modifications to the TR rule that we would like to highlight in this presentation. First, amendments to delay compliance dates for reporting obligations under the rule, including for pre-existing derivatives. Second, the repeal of the local counterparty fallback provision. And finally, an amendment to delay the public dissemination of transaction-level data by designated trade repositories. In respect of the extensions of time for compliance with the general reporting obligations under the rule, where a reporting counterparty to a transaction is a derivatives dealer or a recognized or exempt clearing agency, the duty to report derivatives data in respect of that transaction has been delayed from July 2, 2014 to October 31, 2014. Further, derivatives dealers and clearing agencies are required to report pre-existing reportable transactions no later than April 30, 2015. For all other reporting counterparties, the duty to report derivatives data in respect of a reportable transaction has been delayed from September 30, 2014 to June 30, 2015. Further, the deadline for those counterparties in respect of pre-existing transactions has been delayed to December 31, 2015. As a result of the amendment to delay the general duty to report derivatives data, corresponding changes were made to the provisions governing pre-existing transactions. Changes to the criteria for identifying and reporting pre-existing transactions now depend on whether or not the reporting counterparty is a derivatives dealer or a clearing agency. Where the reporting counterparty is a derivatives dealer or recognized or exempt clearing agency, a derivative transaction is prescribed to be a pre-existing derivative if the derivative was entered prior to October 31, 2014, and the derivative does not terminate or expire prior to April 30, 2015. If both conditions apply, the transaction is deemed to be a pre-existing transaction and must be reported no later than April 30, 2015. However, where the transaction does expire or terminate prior to April 30, 2015, it is not required to be reported. For all other reporting counterparties, a derivative transaction is prescribed to be a pre-existing derivative for the purposes of the rule if the derivative was entered prior to June 30, 2015, and the derivative does not expire or terminate prior to December 31, 2015. If both conditions apply, the transaction is deemed to be a pre-existing derivative and must be reported no later than December 31, 2015. Where the transaction does expire or terminate prior to December 31, 2015, it is not required to be reported. Note that for all reportable pre-existing derivatives, only those fields identified in Appendix A as necessary for pre-existing transactions are required to be reported. The April 17th amendments to the Trade Reporting Rule also include the repeal of subsection 25.2 and subsection 31.4. Together, these provisions were known as the local counterparty fallback. Previously, under the provisions of the rule, a local end user was subject to a residual obligation to monitor whether or not their foreign dealer counterparty satisfied the reporting obligations under the Ontario rule. This is no longer the case. Any transaction between a dealer and an end user must be reported by the dealer, who bears the sole obligation to ensure the reporting has been completed in compliance with the rule. This change was made in recognition of the significant resource and technological costs that local end users would bear in order to implement monitoring systems. The Commission believes that the cost of such a residual monitoring obligation outweighs the benefits and has therefore repealed those provisions. This slide summarizes the important dates in respect to the rule and also reflects changes made by the amendments. The Trade Reporting Rule came into force on December 31, 2013. The general reporting obligation for dealers and clearing agencies now begins on October 31st, 2014. Public dissemination of transaction-level reports by a designated trade repository now begin on April 30th, 2015. And the reporting obligation for all other counterparties begins on June 30th, 2015. This concludes the presentation regarding the amendments to the Ontario OTC Derivatives Trade Reporting Rule. Thank you for your attention.